Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Santita Jackson Show here on AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. It's a joy to be with you today on this cold February day. I hope that you're staying warm. And if you see someone who is cold in their homes, in their apartments, on the streets, direct them to a public building, direct them to a fire department, direct them to a police department, direct them to a library, direct them to City Hall so they can go someplace and be warm. They certainly do deserve that. I have someone who I have really wanted to speak to for a long time. I subscribe to his Substack, JFK Facts, because, like many of you, I missed JFK, President John F. Kennedy, as president. So many of us were not alive at that time, or if we were alive, you don't remember it at all. He was killed 62 years ago, come November. And yet his killing is something that my mother said changed everything. I asked her, what is the most awful thing that happened in your lifetime? She said, without hesitation, the Kennedy assassination. I said, why? Because they were so close to Dr. King. She said, because after that, everything came apart. Even Dr. King remarked after the Kennedy assassination that he knew that he would not make it through the decade, and he did not. So let's talk about it, because now President Trump has said something that is seismic in its impact upon the American people and the intelligence community, quite frankly. He said, release the tapes. Now, they should have been released years ago, but he said, no, release the tapes. When Judge Napolitano asked him why he hadn't released the tapes, he said, this is my disappointment in your last term. He was speaking to him at the end of his first presidency. And he said, if you saw what I saw, you wouldn't release them either. I said, oh, wow. And he said, maybe one day, and this is Judge Napolitano's conveyance of this conversation. He said loudly for his emphasis, one day when I don't have 15 people listening to me at the same time, perhaps I can tell you. So someone who has really been taking this apart is one of the foremost reporters in all of American journalism. I would say in all of journalism. This gentleman, Jefferson Morley. Brilliant. Of course, I've been reading his work in the Washington Post for years, but in Salon, David Talbot, of course, founded that fine publication, and you can catch it online, and I hope you will support it. But I also subscribe to his Substack, JFK Facts. I would encourage you to do that because they really help us just throughout the week to really take this apart, because for so many reasons, and then some more, he helps us to understand all of the pieces. I read your book, The Ghost, The Secret Life of CIA Spy Master Jesus Angleton. He was quite the figure. And it's kind of interesting because I went to Howard, and being in school in Washington, and my brothers were at St. Albans, so we have quite our moorings in Washington, D.C. You know, my sister, who went to St. Andrews there, she said, this is the strangest place. And she's extremely bright. And she said this as a very young girl. She said, you can ride down the street and someone might catch your eye. And then maybe a couple of days later, you'll see them on television and they're leading a coup. As did my Spanish professor at Howard University. He was always a little hostile to me, but it turns out he was part of the overthrow of Maurice Bishop, who was a friend of ours. So there you go. Jefferson Morley, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me, Santita.
Oh, I'm so honored to have you. Let me just start here.
Sure.
The JFK assassination, President John Kennedy's assassination, why does it matter so many years later?
Because we never got a good explanation of what actually happened. And the story that we were told that one guy came out of nowhere and killed the president for no reason. I mean, when we look back at the evidence now, that's not what happened. We can be sure of that. Given all the evidence, the medical evidence, the photographic evidence, we put all that together. We can't say definitively what happened, but we can say definitively that story that one guy fired 3 shots at the presidential limousine, that's not what happened. Okay. The president, the doctors who tried to save his life were clear. He had been hit by gunfire from 2 different directions. He had suffered both frontal and back wounds. So by definition, there was more than one person involved. Now, what was going on? Well, this, people want to know. And we had a process for getting all of the government's records public. Okay. Congress passed a law in 1992. And all these records were supposed to be made public in 2017. Okay. Now we're 8 years later. Trump broke his promise to release them. Biden didn't release them. Now Trump comes back and he says he's going to release them. Well, that's good news, but he announced that a month ago, and we still haven't seen a single piece of paper. So we're waiting. We're hoping that this will be, that we'll get the full story here. And, but, we're not there yet. Now, what is the story? I mean, based on my study of the assassination, which I've been doing for a long time, what the evidence tells me is the president was ambushed by enemies who were able to make the crime look like something else. Okay. And this is the essence of what we call covert action. It's what the CIA does. So am I saying there was a CIA plot? No, I'm not saying that. I don't have evidence for that, but I am saying the pattern of evidence that we have is consistent with that. So let's see all the evidence, and we'll know at least everything that the government knows. Now, is that a vain hope? That's an idealistic hope that the government will be responsive to the people on a very important issue. So, we have a lot of problems in Washington now. President Trump's acting in a very authoritarian way, but this is not an authoritarian measure. This is an anti-authoritarian measure. This is to make a secret intelligence agency transparent. So in this part of what President Trump is doing, I strongly support him, and I hope that he's successful. I will say that, the CIA is going to push back. You can be sure of that. And it doesn't make any difference if a president wrote something down on a piece of paper. The CIA feels that they don't necessarily have to obey those sorts of commands, and they will try to prevail on Trump to hold things back. So there are pitfalls ahead. I'll put it that way, Santita.
Well, do you think that he has a personal investment?
I don't. I think he sees this as a good political issue. He doesn't care personally. If he cared personally, he would have released the records in 2017 when he had a chance. And he traded it away for something else that was more important to him. I do think that other people in his administration are personally committed. Robert Kennedy, it was his uncle and his father. He has strong feelings about this. Tulsi Gabbard has strong feelings about it. So it's not up to the president, or it may be up to the president, but what it really takes is a commitment by the whole government to say, we're just going to do this. We're just going to put all this stuff out there, and the CIA will be mad about this or that, but let the chips fall where they may, is what we should be saying at this point. To the extent that the CIA resists this presidential order, that indicts them in the court of public opinion. We know if they resist this order, that they are concealing criminal activity. There's no other explanation for resisting what is clearly in the public interest.
But this is how they do business, right?
It is. And so, that's why I stick with this story, because this isn't just about what happened a long time ago. This is about, can the government, through its elected representatives, the Congress and the president, make a secret intelligence agency obey? And that's a very profound question in a democracy. And so this raises a question. And President Trump, to his credit, also included the assassinations of Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King in this order. Now, that's a more complicated question to collect all the evidence in those 2 cases, because it's scattered. So that's going to take more time. But if done right, that's still important. There are important records that have never been made public on those assassinations as well. So I would say this is a good start, but we need to see how this thing is really implemented and enforced.
Well, your last posting on JFK Facts discussed why this decision by President Trump peeves, as you put it, the Washington establishment. And I thought this is a very gentle way of putting it, because he gave them 45 days to do whatever they want to do with the records, right?
That Washington Post, or the Washington Post wrote an article last week and said Trump, he's acting on his pet peeves. He issued orders on straws, pennies, and the JFK files. And I was like, what? Okay, pennies, maybe, that straws, sure, that's minor. JFK files, like that's lumped in with triviality, what you're calling trivialities. And that just shows that these big establishment newspapers, and I worked at the Washington Post, and I think it's a great newspaper, or was a great newspaper in many ways. But, they're locked into this position. And so they have this disdain for what most people want, which is just release the records. But the Washington Post is a little too important for what most people think, or so it seems. I don't know. That article, I thought it was very revealing and disappointing. That's what they think about the JFK and MLK and RFK files, these important assassinations in American life. That's like a plastic straw to them. That's a penny to them.
But it seems like that's the narrative they're trying to push.
Yes, it is. It is. And
keep us away from it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, they're in a defensive crouch. The CIA knows that they're very vulnerable in this. Their misconduct around the president's assassination is a matter of record: destruction, deception, false statements. I mean, it's the record of the last 60 years in the CIA and JFK is very consistent. They've always lied about it. So, can we overcome that? And will they be held accountable? That's what this is a question of.
What role can the Congress play in this, if any?
Congress can play a positive role and they can play a negative role. Okay. The Congress has created a task force to investigate what they call federal secrets, which include JFK, RFK, and MLK assassinations, as well as other things like COVID and Jeffrey Epstein. So they're going to do an investigation. They're going to have hearings on March 26th. It's a little bit of a sideshow. It's a spectacle. Unfortunately, it's all Republicans. It's not a bipartisan effort. So no Democrats have joined up on this because they're loading the deck. They're stacking the deck. And Democrats feel like they're not going to get a fair shot if they join this task force. So, they could do a lot of posing for the cameras, generating content for social media that is really not serious. And in fact, maybe a favor to the CIA by just delaying the release of these records. I mean, already now we're talking about, they're going to have a hearing on March 26th. Well, Trump said on January 22nd, he wanted a plan in 2 weeks. Okay. That was 2 weeks ago. There's no plan. The idea that the records would be released immediately. Now we're having a hearing at the end of March, right? They're kicking the can down the road, right? Mm-hmm. They don't want to comply with the law. And these Republican, people who want to have a show up on Capitol Hill, they may actually not care either. So Congress could play a very positive role, have oversight hearings, have people in. Where are these records? How do we make them public? How do we make sure there's no privacy problems with them? Act like a normal legislature is like something you could do under this, not create a social media content factory so that we can bleep out things about Jeffrey Epstein and JFK so that we can get clicks and followers, right? That's not the way to do this. Unfortunately, that may happen because that's the way politics works this way. I don't think it has to happen that way. I think that people are serious about this. I think we should take President Trump in good faith. I think we should get all of these records public quickly.
And I think and support it because we need that. But tell me why, in your estimation, as a journalist, you believe that it is important for us to know this. I've interviewed Abe Bolden before. Of course, the first African-American, the first Black Secret Service agent at the White House who was personally chosen by John Kennedy. Yeah. Of course, the intelligence community, the FBI and the CIA, tried to destroy his reputation because he was asking questions about a potential assassination before it happened. He said, these people, I know they hate me. They're doing horrible things to me in the White House, but they hate John Kennedy.
And his security is suffering as a result.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no. And, in the whole JFK story, there are very few heroes. And Abe Bolden is one of them. Okay. Mm-hmm. Imagine this. Okay. After the president is killed, shot dead in broad daylight, Nobody at the Secret Service loses their job except for one man, Abe Bolden, the guy who comes forward and says, look, one of the reasons for this assassination is the president's security was deteriorating because people hated him. They didn't like him. And I can talk about that. And I can talk about, there was another threat of an assassination in Chicago. And so in return for coming forward, doing his job, seeking to protect the president if he couldn't protect John F. Kennedy anymore. And as a result, he's railroaded, framed, and sent to jail for 6 years. Now, Joe Biden pardoned him. That was way overdue. But his story tells us, the forces that were arrayed against telling the truth in 1963. And it's taken us 60 years to get over it. But we have the example of people like Abe Bolden who did do the right thing, and that's something to remember, when we're doing this and why we should do it right. This man went to jail to make sure that this story came out. So please don't turn it into a Twitter factory. Okay. This is actually important.
Yeah. He went to prison. And I remember him saying on more than one occasion, it could make me cry. He said, I want my name cleared for my children.
Yeah.
And just as he was moving toward the clearing of his names, both of his adult children died within weeks of each other. Oh. It was heartbreaking. I would, just call to check in from time to time. And his son's wife answered. I said, I've been trying to reach your husband. I said, is everything okay? She said, oh, Santita, he passed. He'd been so ill, and he would bring his father to the studio. And then weeks later, his sister passed. And, I see the impact that it had on his family. Just really holding up the bloodstained banner, if you will. And that's why and so what does it mean, Jefferson Morley? Everybody go to his Substack, JFK Facts. Why is it important then for us? See, I'm wondering if this has been part of the destruction of the trust that we have in the government.
Yeah, no, it's a big factor. It's a big factor in the loss of trust and in the hostility that people now reflexively show to the government. One of the things that's really, unfortunate about like that Washington Post article is, people read their major, this is the paper of record in the Capitol, right? And the scorn with which it's treated, right? Like, thank you for reminding me of Abe Bolden. When you read that Washington Post story, do they know the Abe Bolden story?
Absolutely.
No, they don't. Or maybe they do, but they don't care,
They want to continue to throw him under the bus for history.
Yeah, or just ignore him. That's not important. The Warren Commission was right, and who cares what he said, and so yeah, people do mistrust the government. So why does it matter today? Well, one is the government functioning, right? We have a secret agency here. Can we hold it accountable in this case, right? And let's accept for the moment we need a CIA, and okay, but they do have to obey the law when it comes to the assassination of our president, right? You can all agree on that, okay? Can we make that happen actually in this democracy, real democracy that we have today? The jury's out, right? President Trump issued his order. We still don't have any. So that's one reason why it's important. The other reason why it's important is, what Kennedy was doing, especially in 1963. In the first 2 years of John Kennedy's presidency, he's a pretty typical middle of the road Democrat, But in 1963, after the experience of the Cuban Missile Crisis, he is a changed man, and he's trying to pull the country in a new direction, very gently, very eloquently, but steadily. And his actions throughout 1963 reflect that. First, on June 10th, his speech to the graduating class at American University.
Please go into that.
Yeah, so there he's been through the experience of the Cuban Missile Crisis, where he almost had to push the button on a nuclear war. He was very close to having to have to do that, and he wasn't going to have any choice. He was maybe a day or two away from that. I mean, he was frightened because he knew that he could have been in a moment a bigger killer than Hitler ever was. That's how close he came. And so he wants a new direction. And so at American University, he talks about a strategy for peace. He says, we need to have it, not a strategy for war, where we're locked into this thing with the Soviet Union, but a strategy for peace where we can let the people of the world in both countries who don't want to die in a nuclear attack, who are pretty similar to each other in many ways in their daily aspirations. We are more, and we are all mortal, he said, talking about the American people and the Russian people. Yeah, very, very eloquent. Let's wind down this Cold War thing. The next day, he gives another brilliant speech after the assassination of Medgar Evers.
Yes.
And so he goes on TV, the next night on June 11th. And, frankly, Kennedy had been dragging his feet for 2 years on civil rights. Mm-hmm. He wouldn't even sign an executive order banning discrimination in the federal government for fear that it would offend some segregationist somewhere. Martin Luther King, they were fed up. They were tired. It was like, Kennedy, just do this. He talked a good game, but he had not gotten much from, and that night he went out and he said, he changed his mind. He did what a leader does. He said, we have to do this. And he issues that famous, this is an imperative as old as the scriptures, and it's not an institution. And he comes out in favor of the Civil Rights Act for the first time after 2 years of dragging his feet. And so, he's recognizing the reality of the world in which he lives and the necessary changes that have to be made. And that's his mission in 1963. He talks about, he goes to the UN in September and he says, look, let's not have a race with a competition. Let's go to the moon with the Soviets. Science is for mankind. It's not for the benefit of one system or one country. It's for the benefit of mankind. Let's go to the moon together. That was way ahead of its time. Nobody was ready for that. But that's what Kennedy was doing. And he passes the Limited Test Ban Treaty in 1963, first arms control. Not a huge measure, but a measure of, we're in this together. Let's do some common sense things to make sure that we don't have an epic catastrophe and apocalypse.
But wasn't it symbolically huge?
Yes, it was. No, it was. And his generals opposed it unanimously and fiercely. He really had to muster all of his prestige and his political capital to get the whole government to go along with this what was regarded as a pretty bold, very dovish measure. So Kennedy's pulling the country in a dovish direction in 1963. And then he's killed under these mysterious circumstances. A shocking crime, shot in broad daylight by one man, who had
Mr. Morley in the middle of the street. Yeah. And, I just want to go to that for a hot second, because he had said in that American University speech, which I recount so vividly, that world peace was the most important topic on earth.
Yeah.
And he talked about exposing the secret councils. He said, oh, wait, I'm going to expose them. You're going to know. I said, oh my gosh, I can't believe he said this. At American University in Washington, D.C. out loud. Whoa. And, it's because it was, I wanted us to go to that time because people had bomb shelters.
Yeah.
You have to understand, Jefferson Morley, this is so alien to me. I don't know anything.
Yeah, no, and to me too. I was in kindergarten in 1963, so okay. I have no memory. But people just a little bit older than me. Yeah. You would go in a bomb shelter because you thought there could be a nuclear war next week. And it was kind of like you were supposed to think that was normal. And it was Kennedy who said, this is crazy. It's normal to us, but there's no reason to do this. We need to back out of this situation, no matter what our differences. And Kennedy was very anti-communist. He was not. He was from America's ruling class, really, right? He's from a wealthy family, well-connected. His politics are pretty centrist, but he was a man capable of growing and understanding this dangerous situation that and so there's one question is, can we hold the government accountable? And then also, what does Kennedy's presidency tell us? When Kennedy says in that speech, we don't want a Pax Americana.
Yes.
We don't want to be the world's policeman. Okay. That's a great idea. And, you know, I'm afraid that if, no Democratic presidential candidate would now get up and dare to say that and say, no, we don't want this worldwide empire. That's not the way for America to go. He was very clear about that and eloquent about why we should do that. That's been lost in our politics. And Donald Trump has moved in and kind of taken it over and saying, no, we're not going to be the world's policeman. We're going to cut deals for my family. That's what U.S. foreign policy is about. Okay, that's equally wrong. But to jettison all of this imperial ambition, that makes Trump look like the peace candidate, and that's good for him, right?
But let's be honest. A lot of people have been making deals for their families.
Sure.
Too many of these families were involved in Ukraine in their gas companies on their boards.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just, and we're shoveling money to Ukraine. I mean, let's just. It's just. This is. I mean, and I take umbrage with the fact, Jefferson Morley, that no one's asked the questions about that. It's forbidden to ask those questions.
Right.
And for me, that's a problem. That's a problem because when I look at this time with JFK, MLK, and RFK, I see world peace. As soon as Dr. King was done with his speech at the Riverside Church, April 4th, 1967, just after 6 p.m. when he started, and he was killed a year to the day to the minute in Memphis, a year to the day to the minute.
Wow.
Reverend Dr. Wyatt T. Walker walked up to him as he walked out of the pulpit, and he said, "Martin, you have just signed your death certificate." He said, "I know."
After the speech at Riverside Church.
And the harassment, because my parents were staff members by this time. My father formerly was, but everybody in the movement, everybody worked together, right?
Right.
The harassment was unbelievable. And my father and Reverend James Bevel said, we've got so much traction with this poor people's campaign. We've got Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, we've got Rabbi Heschel, we've got all these people who are pulling together elements of the black movement, civil rights movement, and nationalist movement. All these people are coming together, and we're going to sit in on the mall and have a tent city. So I don't know, Memphis didn't feel right to them. Then they get down to Memphis, and the only time Dr. King had a violent incident in his march was there. And it turns out this young man who provoked it, who prompted it, was a Morehouse man, of course, his alma mater, who was CIA connected. And all of his surviving staff members connected his killing to they said, going against ending segregation, okay, that was dangerous. But when you start talking about reorganizing the economy and going against this military industrial complex, that's the red line.
Yeah.
I'd like to know what your thoughts are about that.
Well, I think that we saw Kennedy's policies in Vietnam and Cuba towards the Soviet Union were regarded as dangerous, not just weak or misguided, but as positively dangerous. And with his death, those policies died. Instead of holding back in Vietnam, which Kennedy had been doing for 3 years, we escalated rapidly. We didn't have any more arms control with the Soviet Union for another decade. We never abandoned the policy of overthrowing Castro in Cuba. So, there's making the government work, but there's also the policy vision that Kennedy had, and the idea of that this wasn't a partisan thing. This was the interests of the whole country, and it wasn't a matter of being against communism. It was a matter of being in favor of America, what was best for America, and we've lost that. So, and that's part of the, not only do we not have a credible explanation, but we had this inspiring example, which, occasionally we have glimpses of it. People feel like we're getting back to that, but we have lost something in our politics, that aversion to war. And, when Robert Kennedy was running as a Democrat, I ultimately was not a supporter of his, but, he said one thing that was very commonsensical and that attracted me, and that I thought it was interesting that none of his critics paid attention to, which was he said, the president's first job is to keep the peace.
Mm.
And so, right now we're funding two massive bloody wars.
Mhm.
And it's like we're supposed to accept that as like normal. No, that's not normal, right? We should abhor these wars. Sometimes war is necessary, yes,
Mhm.
but we should do everything possible to prevent these wars. And you look at these wars, they were preventable, right? Give Palestinians a decent life and some human rights, and they won't attack you. Uh, Keep NATO off of Russia's borders, and you won't have a problem. Now, you might say, "Well, Russia's bad, and they're a bully in that neighborhood." Okay, that's true. We live in a mean world, but you know what? It's right on their border. So we got to be.
We wouldn't allow missiles to be in Cuba. I mean, really?
Yeah, right. So we expect them to Russia to say, "Oh, you can have NATO in Ukraine." No, and the best minds in the State Department had been saying ever since the fall of the Soviet Union, whatever you do, don't mess with Ukraine, because that's a red line for everybody in Russia, not just Putin, everybody. Ukraine is part of Russia, and it's going to remain in their orbit. Okay, so this war could have been avoided. The Gaza war could have been avoided, but we don't have a system for that anymore. We have a system, frankly, that's geared to war. It becomes our first option, not our last option. So that's why Kennedy's example and the story of Kennedy's assassination also matters, because Kennedy was trying to get out of this situation where the country's locked into a warlike stance with the world. Okay, we live in a very different world, but we still have that system that is kind of geared to war. And so, as Kennedy said, we're all mortal.
Mm.
We need a strategy for peace. And so that's what the story of Kennedy's death can bring us back to is, why did he matter? What can we do about it today?
Do you see like key figures? I think it's Andy Purdy.
Mm-hmm.
The people, I don't know who survived to, I don't know if, I think Clint Hill was still living.
Right.
But in terms of people who physically witnessed, but people who were on the House committee that studied assassinations.
Yeah.
Fewer and fewer of those persons are still with us.
Right.
Is there, and they were closer to the firsthand information than you or I will ever be.
Right.
Do you see any movement on the parts of people who were looking for those answers? My goodness, I can't believe it. It's almost 50 years ago.
Yeah.
Do you see a greater thirst, not just first with the American public, but also with some people who are not in power, maybe if they're not in power, but proximate to power, to exposing this? Because if you just I watch Washington Journal at some point every day, Jefferson Morley, and they open up the phone lines, and Americans are so angry. And they also have a lot of information. Do they always have the story right? No, but I can't say that I always do. But they know a lot. A lot of them have been in the military, and they've seen things. They've been in wars that they come home questioning, or they're angry about them. Is there a greater, do we want to know the truth? Can we handle it, as Robert De Niro said?
Yeah. That's a great question, because, like right now, so what do we see from our elected representatives? Well, we see Republicans trying to exploit the issue in a partisan way. We have a dedicated research community that has a lot of information about these assassinations and about where records might be and how we might get a fuller picture. But can the government actually do real legislating and accountability as opposed to theatrics? That's the question that's raised by Trump's order is, we could do this, and I think that, your basic point, like, people have a lot of information. When you sit there and say, oh, we're not going to share this information with you, people think that you're tricking them, and you are, and so the government's paying a price for that. And, they think that these agencies, the CIA in particular, presidents come and go. We don't need to do this. And I've dealt with these people in court. I mean, their arrogance is incredible. I mean, they can't imagine. When I met the CIA's lawyers, we had a meeting one time, try and get a settlement, which was hopeless. They were like, "What are you doing? How dare you come in here?" And I'm like, "I'm a taxpayer. We have this thing called the Freedom of Information Act. You're obliged to provide these records. You work for me. Why shouldn't I be here?" And they were like, they thought I was crazy because I cited the law. It was like, you're coming in here and telling the law applies to us. Your law applies to us. They couldn't believe that. So that's the attitude that that has to be broken. And, President Trump is doing his best to wreck the government right now, so we have to deal with that and think about that. But, these agencies, in their arrogance and in their secrecy, they have overstayed their welcome, and they have ignited this anger that Trump has tapped into. So maybe they will understand that they're vulnerable and that the best thing to do in order to enhance the credibility of the government is just to come clean and just put all this stuff out there and quit the games. But is that attitude going to take root in the CIA? Let's hope so.
Well, why is it help me to profile, if you will, the CIA and the FBI? Because when I look at CIA, I think Yale, I think WASP.
Yeah.
I think establishment, FBI, super police, right? But it's
two different cultures. It's two different organizations, for sure. And the CIA is the more, I would say, it deals with foreign countries. So naturally it's a more cosmopolitan workforce. It's not just spooks, it's also like a high-powered university, right? If the president wants to know how many minerals are there in Ukraine, there's somebody at the CIA who knows and can give him a reliable number, right? That's why you have a CIA. It's not just to do dirty tricks. It's also to have quality information for decision makers. So but what unites the CIA is that they are a secretive organization. And let's not forget, okay? I was once interviewing the head of a foreign intelligence service, and he turned to me and he said, "Jeff, let me remind you, the CIA is a law-breaking organization, not a law-making organization."
No, say that one more time.
So this spy turns to me and he says, "Jeff, the CIA is a law-breaking organization. It's not a law-making organization." And that's a very useful thing to keep in mind, right?
Oh, God.
What they do, the essence of what they do, is breaking the law. I mean, that's what covert action is. You're breaking the law of another country to do something. So they're a law-breaking organization, and maybe we need that, maybe we don't. But that people aren't dumb, right? People know that, and so when the CIA comes out and the Washington Post comes out and says, "Oh, these trivial things, these pennies, these plastic straws, these JFK files, pay no attention." Well, people know it's a con game. They know they're being hustled, and so they react accordingly.
Well, okay, let me just shoot some basic questions at you, because I have to have you back to talk about this. Who was Lee Harvey Oswald? Was he the guy in Mexico? Was he the guy in the depository in Dallas? Who was he? Was he the guy whose Russian wife said he spoke flawless Russian?
Well, not flawless, but I mean, who was he? Was he the guy up there in the window?
She said, I'm using her words. She said, "I thought he was Russian because his Russian was so good."
No. He did speak. He did speak good Russian. So first of all, was he the guy up in the window who shot and killed the president? There's very little evidence to support that claim. Okay, most of the evidence suggests that somebody else was responsible. But let's say he was up in the window. In any case, what we now know that we didn't know before was that he had been the object of high-level attention to a small group of CIA operations officers for 4 years before he got there. And they had followed him. They read his mail. They took his picture. They captured his voice on audio surveillance. They knew a lot about this guy as he made his way to Dealey Plaza. So, and then they lied about him, pretended, oh, he came out of nowhere and we didn't know anything about him. So, what he was he was a guy who, in the ex-Marine, very intrepid, self-taught, leftist in political views. Interestingly enough, and this is something that's not known about Oswald, is he was very anti-racist and he was very pro-civil rights. And when his wife and his friends talked about it, one of the things that Oswald emphasized was that he liked about Kennedy was his stand on civil rights, which one of his friends observed was quite unusual. This is a man who grew up in the South and did not go to college, but he'd grown up among poor people and Latin people in New Orleans, and he had an instinctive sympathy for the poor and the underdogs, which made him pro-civil rights and pro-Kennedy, which casts further doubt on why would he shoot the president. And so,
but let me stop you there, because I think that if people knew that, because Lisa Buffundo asked, was he the fall guy? It would cast further doubt.
Oh, absolutely.
Upon his guilt. I think because he had a child, and the fact that his child has to live yoked by this, what to me is a lie. I think it's absolutely cruel.
I agree. And I interviewed Marina Oswald,
his widow.
His widow, yeah, a long time ago, and I found the tape recently and played it. And if you go to JFK Facts and search for Marina Oswald, you can listen to this. And she's quite eloquent that her late husband did not kill the president, and she wanted justice for her family and felt obliged that she had to speak out on his behalf, for the sake of her two daughters. Which I totally understand and sympathize with. Who was he? See, he was somebody who got caught up in something that was much bigger than he was, and he realized that. And after he was arrested, he said he denied killing the president, and he said he was a patsy of others, which, a patsy is a fall guy, somebody who takes the blame for a crime perpetrated by other people. So, he knew something else was going on, and then he's silenced while in police custody. So, that lends credence to his claim that he was a patsy, that people had set him up. So, confronted with this baffling series of events, the government quickly concocts this implausible story that Oswald killed the president for no reason and Jack Ruby killed Oswald for no reason. And, people it didn't make a lot of sense when people said it. And when you had a blue ribbon commission and issue a fat book, okay, maybe. But then people started reading the Warren Commission, and it was like the evidence didn't support the claim.
Who benefited from?
Well, the enemies
assassination.
Well, yeah.
Who or what? Right.
The enemies of Kennedy's policies, okay, were the people responsible for the assassination, and they were the ones who benefited. Now, who those people were they in the CIA, were they in the Pentagon? That's very difficult to say, and I don't have a theory about who it was, but that's what the general evidence tells us. And so, these people, and this is the other reason why I think this is important today. The people who were responsible for this were the faction, the most aggressive faction in the U.S. national security policy making. And that faction, because they were not held accountable at that time, has enjoyed impunity ever since. And so the most extreme interventionist impulses in the American government have free reign. And that's why we have these wars, because for that faction, war is preferable or the least objectionable path to take, and preferable to the path of diplomacy. And that's kind of baked into our system now. And somehow Kennedy's assassination is part of that.
Did it stop? Does it disincentivize people to seek peace?
Well, Jack Kennedy was an unusual leader. in his vision and in his care. And, it took a long time for him to build up the kind of public trust and understanding, which he did in the Cuban Missile Crisis, where people realized this strategy for peace, this is really important. Like he just narrowly averted a global catastrophe. What he's saying is right. And so Kennedy had accumulated political capital. He marshaled his eloquence. The country, the military industrial complex, he's a one man trying to steer a giant ship, and so he's doing it very carefully, but he's doing it by language, by words, by eloquence and deeds, coming out in favor of the Civil Rights Act, but turning these words into deeds and showing the country the strategy for peace can work. And so to have somebody that promising a leader to be cut down and have no accountability, that was discouraging. And that's why the country becomes radical in the 60s and why people are alienated from the system. The Warren Commission is the start of it. It's like the system's not on our side. And that's when people start, this system's not on our side. Whereas, since World War II, everybody, all white people and black people are, coming into their own in the civil rights movement saying, we want first class citizenship. And they're all, Kennedy's like trying to get him there, you have all this capital built up and he's cut down, that was discouraging. That does discourage people from peace. And so people don't want to challenge this machine, they're scared of it and they have reason to be, so that's another thing we got to overcome,
Well, I think that you do have people who challenge it, but they are, they're smeared.
Yeah.
And they are killed. Things happen. When Paul Wellstone opposes the invasion of Iraq, he has a plane crash, which is mysterious. And, I can just keep on going, and maybe Jefferson Morley, because this is my background and I grew up with this. I always look at these things. And Paul Wellstone also managed my father's campaign in 1988 in Minnesota.
Yeah.
These are friends. And I see, the things that the intelligence community continue to do to people who push for peace today. It's to, and, I don't see them as forces for good, and they could be. And I'm not saying that you don't have the Colleen Rowleys and the Ray McGoverns in the FBI and in the CIA. You have a lot of good people in there, but the system itself, how do you get your information? They see, everybody knows you. They see you coming. How have you been able to get this much information? I know Lisa wants to know this.
A couple ways. One, I don't have secret high-level sources. That's not the kind of journalism I do. If you read all my books and all my journalism, I practically never have an anonymous source. I think there were 3 in my first book, and I did 1 article. That's it. I don't do anonymous sources. I talk to a lot of people, and I talk to them on the record with a tape recorder running, so that there's no misunderstanding about what's said. I spend a lot of time, and I listen to people, which not all journalists do these days, because you got a lot of journalists out there who have an incredible record. They've been right about everything every time, and the people who criticize them have been entirely wrong and hypocritical and bad people. That's a very unique class of journalists. Okay. I'm not like that. Okay. I'm not right all the time. Okay. I'm going to tell you, I'm going to marshal all the evidence. And when I tell you something's right, you can take it to the bank, but I'm not right all the time. I listen to people and listen to hear their stories. And, people are not happy about this JFK story. They know that they haven't been told the truth. So people come forward to me and tell me stories. So a few years ago, a man came to me and said he had been working at the CIA on a contract basis, had access to CIA record-keeping systems, and in the course of his other duties, had come across a JFK assassination-related record that had never been made public. And this whistleblower told me about the CIA had a SCIF, a secure compartmentalized information facility that held JFK records at an office building in Northern Virginia, a CIA office building in Northern Virginia near Dulles Airport. So I ran this story in JFK Facts and took a picture of the office building and described what this source said about it. So people come to me and say, and we talked a long time because, he had a high level security clearance, certain legal risks talking about classified information. I mean, he didn't tell me any classified information, but the government could say the existence of that building is a classified secret or something like that, although I figured it out from public records. So, there was certain risk involved. But he came to me and he said, they're not going to release all these records. He realized after Trump, caved to the CIA, like the system's not working. And so he came to me and said, I'm telling you this story because I don't think the government's gonna do this. And somebody's got to get this record that I saw. So, people come forward and tell me. And one thing I hope is that, this congressional committee should listen to this whistleblower. If they're serious about getting JFK records, this is a guy who's been inside the CIA, personally saw them. I can vouch for him. If his name is made public, people will see he's a highly credible source, knows what he's talking about, did have the access that he had. So, one thing that's unique about this moment is that this is kind of in the public discourse, with Trump's letter, signing the executive order with a big flourish. And, this generated a lot of positive publicity. And, maybe that can shame the CIA and people inside the CIA into doing the right thing, but that's where we're at. They're not going to do it because they want to obey the law. They're going to do it because they're too embarrassed to do anything else.
Can they be shamed though? I mean, as we begin,
yes, they can. They can. When Oliver Stone made his movie in 1992, all these records were hidden. The Congress was shamed into doing the right thing, and the CIA had to disgorge a lot of information that they did not want to release. They were not happy about it. Okay, and information which we learned a lot from and was quite incriminating to the CIA. So, yes, in extreme cases they can be shamed when they're threatened, especially. Like they were threatened by Oliver Stone's movie, and now they're threatened by President Trump. So they're under pressure, and maybe that can produce better results.
Will we be strengthened by the truth as an American people, indeed, as in the world?
I think so. I think so, because I think that this will call attention to the causes of Kennedy's death and the dysfunction of our national security system. And President Kennedy's death was, an early sign of just how screwed up that system is. Okay. And so this can be a positive step, coming to terms with the past. Why did President Kennedy die? Why did Martin Luther King die? Why did Robert Kennedy die? Those are hard questions, but, legitimate ones. And we're facing them now. We're getting to the point where we might be able to face them. And if we do, we will understand where our system went wrong and how we can fix it. And maybe, just maybe, we can do something about this corrosive mistrust of government, which makes collective action on anything impossible. When the government has no credibility, we can't do anything for the common good. So we need to restore that sense of credibility of the government. But it has to begin in real accountability and transparency.
Well, if they want to be trustworthy, they need to be worthy of our trust.
Exactly.
And that goes for legacy media and all of that.
Yeah.
They cannot cherry pick.
Yeah.
They cannot cherry pick. Is there anything you'd like to say before we go?
It's a pleasure to be on the airwaves in Minneapolis. I went to high school at Marshall U in Southeast, and my family still lives there. So it's always good to be talking to people in Minnesota, even if I'm in Washington.
Yes. Well, that is wonderful. I mean, it's the heartland. I love it. I love it. But for the record, you're talking to people from all over the country, and we're so excited that you are here because we do want to know the truth. We need to know the truth because I think that we will be strengthened as a people when we do know the truth, and we can rebuild.
Yes.
We can rebuild because there's some things, there's a lot that needs to, I think we're grown enough. Jefferson Morley.
Yeah.
Every republic has a review or a reset, every 200 years or so. And I think that's where we are. Well, 250 years next year.
Right.
So, but thank you. And thank you for your work. down through the years. Just thank you, thank you, thank you for all that.
Thank thank you for having me, Santita, and reminding me of why this matters today.
Oh, it does matter. It really does matters more than we know. Blessings
Yeah.
to you, Jefferson Morley, everybody. JFK Facts, go to the Substack. These great journalists need our support. Many of them are not with Legacy Media, and Legacy Media, quite frankly, won't have them. And that's a good thing. There's some clubs you don't want to be in,
Yeah.
because the fact is, it's the only protected profession in our Constitution.
Yeah.
Because we cannot be free without people like Jefferson Morley. And I thank you for your work.
Thanks for having me, Santita.
Blessings to you. AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. I'm Santita Jackson. See you in a little bit.